This next lesson, 6.6 and 6.7, is focused on comparing fractions. Now there are a few different things that we can use to help us compare fractions. Let's go ahead and take a look at the first way. The first thing that we can use to help us when comparing fractions is compare our fractions to a benchmark. A benchmark is a known size or amount that helps you understand another size or amount. In this case, a really good benchmark for us to use is the benchmark of 1/2. 1/2 is a really good benchmark for us to use because it's pretty easy for us to find. We take a look at our denominator and then we look at our numerator and say to ourselves, is our numerator greater than or less than half of our denominator? If it's greater than half, well then it's greater than half of a whole, and if it's less, well then it's less. So that's a good judgment for us. It helps us when comparing fractions because we can look at our two fractions. If one of them is less than 1/2 and the other one is greater than 1/2, we can easily determine which fraction is greater. So we're going to take a look at these 6 fractions underneath here, and we're going to list them if they're greater than 1/2 or if they're less than 1/2. And we're just going to move them around a little bit. Let's start with 2/6. Now 1/2 of 6 is 3. So if we have a fraction that's 2/6, that's less than 1/2. That's less than 3/6. So that's going to fall on our less than side. We have 2/6. That's where that one's going to fall. It's less than 1/2. Our next fraction is 5/8. So I'd look at my denominator of 8. What's 1/2 of 8? 1/2 of 8 would be 4/8, and 5/8 is greater than that. So 5/8 would fall on our side that is greater than 1/2. Our next fraction is 2/3. When we're dealing with odd numbers, it becomes a little bit more tricky. We really have to think about some math. 1/2 of 3 would be 1.5. That would be 1/2 of 3. Considering 2 is greater than that, this fraction is greater than 1/2. So 2/3 is more than 1/2 of 3. Our next one is 6/10. So we'd look at our denominator of 10. And what's 1/2 of 10 equal to? Well, 1/2 of 10 would be 5/10. So 6/10 is greater than 1/2. Our next one is 1/4. 1/2 of 4 would be 2. So 2/4 would be equal to 1/2. 1/4 is less than that. So that's going to fall on our less than side. And then our last one is 3/5. Again, this is an odd number, so it makes things a little bit tricky, but 1/2 of 5 would be 2.5. That would be 1/2 of 5. In this case, 3/5 is greater than that, so 3/5 would fall on our greater than side. Now, how is this going to help us? Maybe we have something like this that we need to compare. It shows us 6/9 and 2/8. By determining where these fractions fall in relation to 1/2, we're able to compare our fractions and determine which one's greater. Sometimes when we look at fractions, it can be a little bit tricky to figure out which one is the larger fraction. So 6/9. 1/2 of 9 would be what? 1/2 of 9 would be 4.5. So 6/9 is greater than 1/2. 1/2 of 8 would be 4/8, and 2/8 is less than 1/2. So if 6/9 is greater than 1/2 and 2/8 is less than 1/2, 6/9 is the greater fraction. That's how comparing to our benchmark helps us. Now there are a few other things that we need to keep in mind when we're comparing fractions that can be incredibly helpful. The first one is when we're comparing fractions with the same numerator. That's our number on top. We've already discussed in class that as the denominator increases, the size of our parts decrease. So 1/2 is greater than 1/4, which is also greater than 1/6. If we saw two fractions that we were comparing, let's say we saw something like 2/8 and 2/5. Notice that they both have a 2 in our numerator. This helps us identify This set of information helps us identify which of these fractions is greater. So as our denominator increases, the size of those parts decrease. So the size of my parts, if an object is split into eighths, is going to be less than the size of the parts if the object is split into fifths. So 2/5 is going to be the greater fraction because its parts are larger and we're getting the same amount. Think about it like pizza. If a pizza was split into 8 slices or if a pizza was split into 5 slices. If it was only 5 slices and you ate 2, you would eat more of that pizza than if it was split into 8 slices and you ate 2. Another helpful hint is when our fractions have the same denominator. So if the denominator is the same, the larger numerator indicates the larger parts of the whole, or the larger fraction. So in this case, we see in our picture that if an object is split into 4 pieces, if we eat 1/4, then we eat 1/4 of our, and the 2/4 is greater, and then 3/4 is even greater. So as our numerator increases, if our denominators are the same, the larger numerator indicates the larger fraction. If we had these two fractions that we were comparing, if we were comparing 5 and 3/6, we can see that their denominators of 6 are the same, so the fraction with the greater numerator is the greater fraction. If a pizza is split into 6 slices and I eat 5 of them, or if a pizza is split into 6 slices and I eat 3 of them, which pizza did I eat more of? The one with 5 slices. All right, go ahead and compare these fractions using that information. Compare them to a half. Look at their numerators and denominators and figure out how that's going to help us compare these fractions. For number 1, if we look at this, we see that they both have a 1 in the numerator. So we know that the larger denominator is the smaller fraction. In this case, one pizza is split into 4 pieces while the other one's only split in half. The half is larger. So 1/2 is larger than 1/4. Number 2. Let's compare these fractions to a half. Is 2/3 less than or greater than a half? 2/3 is greater than a half. And is 3/7 less than or greater than a half? It is less. So we see that because 2/3 is greater than a half, it's greater than 3/7. Our next fraction, these two fractions have the same denominator. So we just talked about that right back here. When we're comparing our fractions with the same denominator, the larger numerator indicates a larger part of the whole. So 4/5 is going to be the greater fraction here. And then our last one, if we compare to 1/2, we see that 1/2 is equal to 1/2 here. And then 4/6, half of 6 is 3. So this one is greater than, so that's going to be our greater fraction. Now, there's also a useful way to help us determine and compare fractions. This is called comparing fractions using the butterfly method. Now, it's really important that when we're using this method, we follow the correct steps, but it's really going to help us when we look at some fractions that get pretty close. Maybe they are 2 fractions that are on the same side of that half. The butterfly method can help us out a lot. To do this, we need to do some cross multiplication. So what we're going to do is we're going to draw our butterfly wings. And then we're going to draw our little antenna for our butterfly, and that's where we're going to put our products. So we're going to do some multiplication. We're going to multiply 9 times 6, and that product is going to go on that antenna, and then we're going to multiply 8 times 5, and it's going to go on that side. So 9 times 6 is equal to 54. 8 times 5 is equal to 40. Whichever side has the larger product is the larger fraction. So in this case, 54 is greater than 40, so 6/8 is greater than 5/9. We can do the same thing for our problem below. So we're going to draw our wings of our butterfly, and then we're going to draw our antenna. 4 times 9 gives me 36. Notice how I'm multiplying up. And then I have 13 times 3. 13 times 3 gives me 39. So this fraction 3/4 is greater than 9/13. The butterfly method is a pretty awesome way for us to compare fractions, compare them pretty quickly, and double check our work. Last thing I want you to do is compare these fractions, and then we have one word problem that we need to look at. So go ahead, using any method, compare the fractions that are here. For this first fraction, we have 5/5 and 4/6. We really don't have to do any math to compare this fraction. 5/5 is equal to 1 whole. 4/6 is not equal to 1 whole, so 5/5 is going to be greater. Sometimes all it takes is looking at these fractions a little bit. All right, our next one, we have 6/9 and 9/12. Both of these fractions are greater than a half, so that makes it a little bit challenging, a little tricky. So maybe for this one, I bust out my butterfly to determine which fraction is greater. 9 times 9 gives me 81. And 6 times 12 gives me 72. So 81 is greater than 72, so this fraction is greater. I could have also simplified these fractions to help me out. If I did that, I would have divided this top number and this bottom number by 3, and that would have gotten me 2/3, and this other one would have gotten me 3/4, and because sequentially 3/4 is larger, that's also the larger fraction. All right, my next one, it already has a half here, so maybe I just compare to a half, and that's going to help me identify if it's greater than or less than. Half of 9 would be 4.5. 5 is greater than that, so 5/9 is greater than a half. And for my last one, this one's a little tricky, so maybe I'm not quite sure how I'm going to solve this. Maybe I simplify before I do butterfly, or maybe I just go ahead and do the butterfly method straight away. I can do either way. If I multiply this side over here, I get 300. And then over here, I get 180. So 300 is definitely greater than 180. And that tells me that 3/9 is greater. I could have also simplified these fractions, and that would have helped me out. So here, if I divide by 20 and divide by 20, I would have been left with 1/5. Whereas for this one, if I divide by 3 and divide by 3, I'm left with 1/3. And here, really easily, when I have 1/3 and 1/5, I can determine that 1/3 is the greater fraction. All right, last step. Brady ran 5/7 of a mile. PJ ran 4/6 of a mile. Who ran further? For this problem, I'm comparing 5/7 and 4/6, and I want to see which of these fractions is the greater fraction. Maybe I start with some simplification if I can. I see here that this is a prime number, so 5/7 is already simplified, but for this I could divide by 2, and that would give me 2/3. Does that help me at all? Not a super lot, so then maybe I go to my butterfly method to go ahead and check and determine which of these fractions is greater. 4 times 7 gives me 28, and 5 times 6 gives me 30, and 30 is greater than 28. So who ran further? Brady ran further because 5/7 is greater than 4/6. All right, that's our lesson for today. We covered a few things. We covered the butterfly method for comparing fractions. We also talked about comparing fractions by understanding what happens when they have the same denominator, what happens when they have the same numerator, and then using our benchmark of 1/2 to really help us out. Tomorrow we're going to be comparing 3 or 4 fractions to each other, so these skills that we learned today are super important to help us tomorrow. See you then.